Hello and welcome to the Intermediate Drawing course. I am Taylor Payton and this is Lesson 1. So in the interest of just getting the most information in the least amount of time so you can get to drawing, let's just kind of hop in here. So we're going to talk about line. Line is basically an abstract mark that conveys information. There are none of them in nature. You will not go out to the beach and pick up a line in the sand. You will not dig inside of a tree stump and find a line in there. However, our brain can translate nature, imagination, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and perceptions into line. So every mark in line is a statement. Basically, even brush strokes, if we're going to be talking a little more painterly, all that is you making a visual statement. So on the picture plane, all statements are related to and interacting with other statements. The line and statement types we've kind of gone over in the beginner drawing course if you've taken that. Basically, we have vertical lines, strong and constructive, as well as horizontal. Those fall into the same category. Diagonal or dynamic and less constructive. Then we have convex lines, pressing outward, or concave if you think of them as caving inward. They are flowing, organic, and they are the least constructive. So repetition is also important. We're going to be repeating a lot of our lines and varying them in thickness just so we can get different visual statements that help to convey different ideas or information. And you can kind of see a little demonstration here of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines making up a triangle. These two are very structural, and this one is sort of a little less structural, a little more dynamic, more sloped. Basically, when I'm referring to constructiveness, it's that any of these lines or statements can multiply in their constructive solidity when combined with one another. So that's like this shape here, this mass, if you will, has more construction because it's a combination of lines. So as if you were building a house, for example, using a triangular truss. Basically, lines that form an enclosure become shapes. We can also refer to those as masses. So those are the combination of line, and they can kind of be a part of any picture plane that you'd like. We're always going to be using triangles, circles, squares, cylinders, pyramids, tetrahedrons, every kind of shape you can imagine. Again, we'll go over those as we create them down the line. I just want you to understand that we can learn to wield those four basic line types, again, which are horizontal, vertical, diagonal, flowing or organic, and those four basic ones. So we have them labeled here. And it's like all of our lines that we combine, we get more potential shapes. Though more shapes and lines, we do get more complexity, which can be harder to manage as we begin to add up all those lines. Chaos really results when we create a lot of complexity without clarity. So complexity is not beauty or structure. The unity, variety, clarity, and design of what we're drawing, that is where we find more beauty. So one really big part of learning to draw or learning to amplify your drawing abilities is to kind of develop your taste more so. So for example, I work my way through the BARG drawing course once in a while, and a really big thing they try to impose is the sense of beauty, like what they find beautiful, what they find very academic, and how that translates into the work you're going to be doing. And I just want you to understand that unity, variety, clarity, and design are always going to have a beautiful element to them because we have structure and we have order. Not to say that we can't have spontaneity as well, but when you're working with line, you want to make sure that your structural points, your stuff is fairly orderly, because if you get lost, then the viewer's going to get lost. So you want to make sure that you make things as easy to understand as possible. They don't always have to form shapes. They can be used to kind of break them up and subdivide them. Or they can just guide your drawing process and get erased later. One of the best reminders I like to think of is look for points. So almost like you're 3D modeling something, you can use those points as means of connection to form shapes or even more abstract kind of curves. Points, they connect and separate lines, shapes, and space. They're really good markers for parsing complexity, increasing memory, and guiding overall. So every time you're having a rough time drawing something, you can always imagine it three-dimensionally by putting points around and using those points as a means of relativity, things you can relate to and connect up to. So you can also consider them vertices, if you're thinking more along the lines of a 3D modeler. They can project lines or shapes, so basically they connect and they project. Points are very useful, and we will go into them more later during the demonstration portion. So this is an optional assignment. I gave this to one of my mentees a while back. You can look at this PDF if you want to try this, if you're feeling like you need a little bit of a warm-up. But for now, I think I'm going to hop into the demonstration portion. You can look at this PDF and just do this before actually doing the assignment I'm going to give you as a result of this course. But there's just a couple more pages of some ideas about mark making and different types of lines you can create, and also reminders to keep your wrist healthy. But that's enough information for now. Let's hop into the demonstration portion so I can actually show you the application of that information. All right, welcome back. Now we're going to be drawing some portraits here real quick. These are not from reference. These are stylized, and we're just going to be using them to talk about some of the line information that we just discussed in the previous portion of Lesson 1. So as you can see, I'm already using a fair amount of vertical and horizontal lines in bisecting the head, subdividing it, as well as a fair amount of diagonal lines to increase the structure but also have enough dynamism. So the basic shape is a kind of a egg shape that you kind of use to create a basis that you can then work a full head into by using more constructive lines. If everything's round, then nothing is round. You know, you really have to have some contrast, some structure, some verticality, some horizontal elements, some diagonal elements, and then you have a mixture of more curved elements as well, whether those elements are concave or convex, to help to create a full and balanced sort of piece using these line-based tools. As you can see, I'm working mostly inline, just creating shapes out of the lines. Those shapes could be called hair, those shapes could be called eyebrows or facial hair or a tie. We have two triangles that kind of make up the collar of the shirt. And this is the rough sketch phase. This footage has been sped up, so I don't want you to feel bad. This is, again, just in the interest of giving you the information in a way that isn't too long-winded, but also isn't super short, so there's just enough time to absorb it and apply it. I found that in the beginner drawing course, some of the lessons got a little bit long, and if you are watching, you're not drawing. And what I'm telling you is really just basically the tools you need to start applying to take your drawing to a more intermediate level or to, verge on advanced. Even if you've been drawing for several years, some of these ideas and notions and principles can help take you to higher levels of practice and study and inspire you to work in a more cohesive and unified fashion. So speaking of working, what I'm doing here is I've just dropped the opacity on a previous layer, and now I'm drawing again on top of my sketch and creating forms. I'm creating shapes. We'll talk more about forms in a later lesson. I'm creating shapes that my lines are enclosing and that I'm shading in using some of the mark making that you have an optional practice for in the first PDF in this course. So now that I've knocked down the opacity and I have a basis, it's really like tracing your own artwork, which to me is just a really joyous process. When I learned this trick, it felt like cheating because it's almost like using your own art as reference. Like if you drew a character once and you want to draw it even better, and you can already objectively see what would make that character better, and you just look at the previous picture while drawing the new character, your game will elevate. Your work is just going to improve because you have a point to start with, a visual piece to kind of start the puzzle. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking some of those mark making tools to use lines to create shading, and this is something I'm going to ask you to do in your assignment as you draw a bunch of these portraits. Heads are a great thing to draw. So I know a lot of you guys are figure-based artists, but even if you're not, heads will give you almost everything you need in terms of all the different line types, ways to shade, structure, form. There's a reason why people have made a living doing just portraits. The face is something we can identify with in pretty much every single, society on the planet. As humans, this is what we look at. We look at the sort of countenance that everybody brings. So we have this semi-confident, kind of cocky, stylish, bearded man, and I used a lot of lines to kind of describe the texture of the hair. One great way to use line, if you haven't been doing it already, is to use it to describe textures. So these can be folds in cloth, these can be hair, and basically all you're doing is creating a lot of lines rapidly with enough organization to create the effect. So it's not like the marks aren't contained within very clear shapes that the beard is made out of, and that gives it not only texture, but it also gives it mass. So this is just little adjustments going on here and there, recreating the shape of the nose and shading it in, and kind of finishing up some of the edges and flipping the canvas. Always make sure you flip the canvas, always make sure you're squinting at the canvas. These things can help elevate your perceptions so that you have a much more kind of refreshed look. We have a tendency to kind of zone out after drawing for a while, and that can create really lackluster results because we're not really seeing anymore. And seeing is something I'm going to emphasize over and over in this course. Just because if you're not seeing it, you can't fix it, you can't elaborate upon it, you can't help it evolve. So always training your perceptions upward is a really important part of becoming a better artist. And that's something that I'm going to impress upon you in this assignment as well once we get through all the demonstration portions. So this is essentially just going in, getting rid of extra marks, which I'm seeing as less than desirable, and so I erase them. I'm always adjusting the shapes and trying to have more succinct lines. So I'll go ahead and just kind of get rid of some, add some. The addition and subtraction dance is one that you'll get used to as you begin to grow more proficient in your line work. So this is just one way of drawing a character, and this is a male head. So now we're going to go into a female head demonstration with a little less detail. Detail, in this case, consisting of the textures that were placed. So now that I already have a drawing on the page, it's easy for me to reference things like the collar and understand how to rotate those shapes around. Once you've already done your first drawing on the page, your first head drawing, then I'll ask you to create a bunch more of them, and they should be getting easier. You can use reference, you can use your own drawings as reference, as long as you're just bringing unity and clarity to the line work, and you're designing your shapes, as well as thinking about whether you want it to be convex, whether you want it to be diagonal, whether you want it to be very soft and feminine and have more curves to it, or a little more masculine and have more straights. So all these ways of expressing and using the tool that is line are immensely helpful, because it just increases your toolkit. And so once you really begin to understand and see all these different types of lines, like all the convex lines in her hair, and the simple subtle curved lines of her jaw, then other lines look much straighter, like the lines of the collar or the lines in her neck. Basically, all of these different modalities of line and even a little bit of shading are going to help you feed your creative powers and potencies, and allow you to level up your line work and think more about where to place certain lines or certain shapes, and thus you'll be able to just have more drawing appeal. Your work will look more intermediate, especially if you felt like a beginner for a while, or if you're looking to just kind of increase your journeyman or journeywoman abilities. So a little bit of extra shading that I wasn't digging, so I just kept taking it away. Let's talk a little bit more in the next demo. All right, this is the final demo of Lesson 1. I will be having a little bit of a lecture at the very end of it, wherein we will look at the two demonstrations and break them down in terms of the types of lines, as well as some shape or mass, and that will allow us to have a better understanding moving forward prior to starting the assignment. So as far as this demonstration goes, this is some quick fan art of Megaman. If you're not familiar with Megaman, I don't know what to tell you, because he's probably one of the most popular video game characters in history. But basically, I just wanted to have a character that was already mostly designed for me, simply because I don't want to always spend time designing as well as drawing. That's a really huge tip that I can offer, and a really big reason to be doing fan art as an intermediate artist is because not only do you not have to worry as much about the design unless you're doing a redesign, but you can just focus on your drawing fundamentals and really make those solid, and that will permit you to ascend in technical ability and expression. Most of this course, we're going to be talking about building technical ability. That's about 80% of the course, just like 80% of the course is going to be line-based. However, I still want you to consider the emotion you're trying to convey, or the feeling, or the general kind of sense that you're trying to give people when they look at the picture. Is it a feeling of cool? Is it a feeling of awe? Is it funny? Is it comedic? Is it sort of a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor type thing? That's something to really consider as you're creating any piece of art, save for just straight up technical studies, which, don't worry, there will be plenty of that. So essentially what I'm doing is really similar to the last kind of portrait demos. I'm just going in and sketching out all the big details and placements that I really would like to have in the final before jumping to a second layer, a second drawing. And this to me is really important because it allows me to be a little less cohesive. The first time you draw something without reference or without any big ideas already, it's going to be sloppier and sketchier. So that's why the second iteration of drawing is there. That's why there's lots of erasing and redrawing. But there does come a time where there is enough information, and one can then go back in and begin much more succinct drawing as far as the process is concerned. So here you see me going in with a lot of very straightish lines that are more angular in nature. There's a lot of opportunities for round shapes on organic forms. However, Megaman is only semi-organic. He's kind of a mixture between a machine and a man. So basically what I'm doing is hinting at that with harder surface line delineations. And those delineations come in the form of mostly diagonals. So you'll notice I didn't completely round the helmet. I have a somewhat of a diagonal bent to it. And I didn't really round out those earpieces that are on the helmet as well. It's really more about getting in that structure and that feeling of solidity, because again, it is a masculine character. I tend to go a little more curved when it comes to more feminine characters, and that's just how I like to parse it. Very straight diagonal lines for the neck, and then sometimes I'll run over my line several times to increase its thickness. That's how you can begin to weight things and make them seem heavier, or to start converting them from lines into shapes. Again, we will be getting into that in lesson 2, so please don't get too anxious to work in a more shape-based modality yet, simply because I want you to focus on your lines for now, much like I am here. So essentially just mirroring some of the designs in the helmet in the neck piece, and staying zoomed in until I get the facial expression that I am looking for. Not too young, not too old, and a little bit battered, a little bit beat up. Some of the armor falling off, just because that makes for a little bit better of a narrative than a character just standing there in a pose. It's more interesting also to think of the mechanical nature of Megaman and what underlies some of the pieces that he is composed of. So for example, if you've ever opened up one of your old electronics or appliances, you see that it has a shell around it, a shell that is really very, it's more aesthetic. It does have a function. There's like the kind of breeding between form and function. But if you've ever opened up, like, say, a console that wasn't working, you see that it's full of things that need protection, and there's a lot more complexity underneath. There's a lot more shapes. There's a lot more things like circuit boards and chips and some of the different kind of breakups of screws and where you can actually place all that stuff. And some of that's what I wanted to showcase in his arm there. Some of the artificial muscles that are implanted. it's really just about getting each of these line types down now, because I'm being very picky at this point since this is the second drawing iteration. Going in and subdividing some of his mechanical pieces. And I think it's just really good to utilize semi-mechanical or semi-machine characters or ideas. If you want to do robot portraits, like throw in a couple robot portraits or a couple like robot type heads when you're doing your assignment. This is a full body piece just because I want to show you where we will be going in the course later down the line. But it's really important to note that you don't have to be doing that at this point. Even if you are intermediate, I'm sure you've drawn a couple of different bodies before. We will talk about proportions and measuring them out and using lines to help us with that process. But really this is more about just trying to weight the lines, which I didn't showcase as much in the first demonstration. And it's also being even more meticulous with the lines. So some of the pieces are floating off or breaking off. I figure maybe he has an ability to convert them into energy. If he's, not using them anymore, the pieces are falling off anyway, then maybe he could use them to power up his blaster. One thing you saw me kind of doing as well is zooming out and getting a bigger look at the picture. In addition to always squinting and always flipping the canvas and rotating the canvas, you want to zoom in and out as well. All these different ways of increasing the size, decreasing the size, rotating the image, giving your brain different ways to look at it is 100% an intermediate to an advanced technique. As a beginner, you should have started squinting and rotating the canvas and flipping and zooming in and out as well, just because these things are always going to help serve you in your quest to see it more truly, to see it better, whatever it is you're looking at, whatever it is you're studying. So that's something that I really, really want to impress upon you as well. One cool thing I'm doing right now is adding some marks that denote power or movement. We live in, atmosphere or air or ether, and it's really, it's not as dense as water, but it is a medium. Sound travels through a medium. That's why my voice is getting picked up in the microphone right now. And whenever you're drawing a character, or drawing anything for that matter, you can think about the medium that they exist in and have marks that kind of help to showcase what's going on. Maybe there's a lot of dust particles floating in the air. Maybe they're using an energy attack and you can see some of the different motions and some of the particles of the environment moving in a certain response to that energy. Because we never see the wind, we see how it affects things. So that's what I'm trying to convey here, basically. Another thing I want to note is that you see me enclosing off certain shapes and then shading them in, much like I did with some of those quick portraits that I drew. And that is basically to help pop things in front of other things. We always want to be thinking in terms of dimensionality on the canvas. And when you're working solely with line, things can get very flat very easily. And you're just seeing me kind of circumvent and use ways to avoid that here, because I want to really get the various pieces to look like they're separate. The hand is out on top of the blaster is above the leg, etc. And one way to do that is just running over the line several times and thickening it to put a shadow underneath it. I'll often draw in the shape of the shadow before I shade it in, just because that's what I've learned from the bar drawing course, as well as seeing a lot of other intermediate to advanced artists kind of use that technique. So lastly, I'm making some marks or some dents and cuts and broken pieces on the actual pieces of armor themselves, in addition to using some of those small occlusions where I'm just creating really small triangles or really small quadrilaterals, little shapes basically, to again help things pop in front or fall behind other things. And that's something I want you to look out for as you're creating your artwork, as you're working on the heads in the upcoming assignment. How do you make an ear look like it's popping off the head? How do you, make nostrils dark enough so they look like there's not light getting inside of them? I don't want you to worry too much about value scales and structures at this point. It's going to be, more in the middle of this intermediate drawing course. But for right now, I really want you to concern yourself with how you can thicken and change your line work, how you can think solely in line to have a better result when it comes to things looking dimensional. I'm also subdividing the forms by adding different lines and delineations within the silhouette, within the character. And this is some of the shading I'm doing right now, just a little more necessary because it was really hard to make out that was above the leg. So that's sort of a mandatory bit of shading there. But you notice like I'm separating some of the quad muscles underneath whatever his armor skin is there. And I'm using some lines to run up and down and contour the torso. Here you see me rotating the canvas just to get a better idea of how my marks are looking in different views and perspectives. But this is basically it, this demonstration of Megaman as a sort of, my version of Megaman, thinking about him as a battle-worn Reploid at this point and charging up for maybe one final attack, using some of the ether and atmosphere to charge said attack. The basis is just to start thinking about things, beyond, a little bit beyond the 4 line types, thinking about line thickness, thinking about how to make a shape and then shade it in so that you have a little bit more of an occlusion or something popping, or a little bit of a shadow. Again, we're 80% line, 20% mass or shape. So that's kind of the last little bit there of helping pop the character by having a final shape underneath the feet. So let's break these down a little bit more visually, and then I'll give you your assignment. All right, so before I give you your assignment, let's talk about the 4 basic line types: vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and curved, aka concave or convex. So a diagonal line would be this, for example. That's a pretty good diagonal right there. We also have a very similar diagonal line right here, again increasing the dynamism but still keeping some structure. We also have vertical and horizontal lines. Here's a good example of a vertical line. Even more structural, keeps the head up. This is fairly vertical, a little bit diagonal, but not entirely. We also have our horizontal lines, and those can be found more or less all the way across the bottom here. It's not completely horizontal, but it's implied that it's a horizontal line. It just sort of helps to bring about a slight breakup. All these aren't exactly perfect because these are organic figures. If I were doing buildings, I'd have a better time showing perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. And lastly, we have our curved lines, which again make up most of your figures. So that's like these lines, all quite curvy. And it's really easy to spot these types of lines in reference. It's really easy to mimic them and use them and add them to your toolkit so that you can use them to express your work. We also have occlusions. So those occlusions, I'm going to mark in red, like right here. That's a little occlusion. We have one right here as well, helping to separate the forms. This I would consider an occlusion. And we could put some basically anywhere we want things to seem separate. So if I were to knock the brightness down, I could have an occlusion right here, small occlusion right here. Again, a lot of them are triangular in nature, or at least it's easy to create them when they're more triangular, just because we're all familiar with drawing triangles. So I could start to shade in this triangle right here to emphasize the shadow underneath the neck, the lack of light hitting it. As far as being able to weight lines, that's something that we can do in order to, again, create dimension without it being an occlusion. So weighting the line would be, let's say we want to increase the thickness of this exterior line, and I can run the entire contour of this character. And that would help to emphasize and also stylize a lot of things, because the inner lines are going to be remaining pretty much the same thickness. So if I were to just quickly run the contour of this character, you can see that it has a different sense of dimension and pop from the page now. That's one way of doing it, to add a line stroke all the way around the elements you want to separate. And that can be, depending on what you're going for, a nice stylistic choice. It just helps you separate out certain elements. I've done it fairly successfully on a few pieces. It's not something I usually go for just because it really lends itself to more of a comic style or maybe anime or manga. But if you're into that, then that works really well. You can see it works nicely with some of the occlusions. So line weights, that's one way of doing it, is to have a weighted line all the way around. Other ways to weight your lines are, for example, I can add emphasis in certain areas without fully weighting around and contouring shapes completely, because that could be a little heavy-handed, so we can apply those heavier lines in more subtle ways to bring certain forms more forward. We don't have to contour them all the way. And you'll know when to start using an occlusion versus when to just weight the lines. And it's really helpful to understand that heavier lines typically come forward, and lighter lines, smaller lines, are used to kind of fade backward. Like all this stuff would look like it's kind of behind him. So if I give them horns, those look like they're not on the front of them, they look like they're in the back. But the more weight that I add to them, the more they kind of come to the fore. And that's a good way to utilize line weights. Mark making, that's all this stuff in the beard. That's basically just another modality for shading. If they cross like this, it's hatching. If they don't cross, then it's just a different type of mark making, different type of shading. You'll find one way your wrist really likes to do it, and then you can use that to shade areas in. For example, if I wanted to shade in her shirt, I would maybe go diagonal. And just hatch all the way across that. You can keep it as consistent as possible for more beauty and uniformity. That's always helpful. But I tend to get a little impatient, which is admittedly my own fault. But yeah, you can really utilize shading and hatching to great effect. You can add detail by keeping your lines very thin and making marks inside of pre-existing shapes and masses, or you can add certain emphasis in other areas. But regardless, these are just some of the line tools I wanted to kind of add to your toolkit. They will now help you advance to a more intermediate level. Since I've kind of broken down these types of lines here, you can see them all in the Megaman piece as well. Just some darker shaded parts with the mark making. A lot of good line weighting here, thicker, thinner, much thinner. Then we start going to thick again. And that helps create a more dimensional form, letting these kind of stick out and letting these sort of fade back. I did some occlusions here and just kind of shaded in this whole shadow shape underneath him to give him a inference that there's a ground plane that he's standing on. And we have some thicker lines here. This is a pretty uniform shape. A little thinner back here so it can fall back, a little thicker right here so it can come forward, or underneath works really well, because then it helps to infer that the light is coming from above and that whatever is not being illuminated has a thicker line underneath it. So it's a very subtle way of doing it and creating more form and dimension and heft. I didn't really separate this as much as I could have here, for example. So that's one way of doing that. If I wanted to add a little more interest, I could also, again, use that kind of mark making to help add some detail and delineate certain parts. It's all about utilizing line to create interesting effects of form, dimension, and also sense. So like, for example, you can see that adds more detail, more interest, and it's debatable on whether you want that much detail or that much interest drawn to a certain area, but I just want you to have these tools in favor of being able to create with a broader spectrum, and kind of know when you can start to deploy them as well. So a lot of good diagonal lines in Megaman, making it feel dynamic, rounding it out a little bit in the calves, keeping it a little more stark in the quad muscles and upper legs, same with the core, same with the helmet. So yeah, that pretty much covers it, or at least recovers what we talked about when we first began this lesson. Let's go to your assignment. Alright, so now we find ourselves at the assignment portion of Lesson 1 of the Intermediate Drawing course, and our assignment is going to be drawing 75 heads. So 75 heads that utilize occlusions, weighted lines, and mark making of some sort. So the occlusions are those small areas of shadow, shape, or contrast. The weighted lines being, thick to thin to barely perceptible to very heavy, just all sorts of line weights. Mark making of some sort, meaning shading, texture, etc. Hair, clothes, just so long as you're utilizing your mark making abilities and not just going with the 4 basic line types. So at least 2/3 of the heads from reference, meaning 50 of them. You can do 25 from imagination just to get experimental or to test your sort of learning thus far. You can use the hashtag INTDrawCourse1 for the Lesson 1 assignment, and I will hopefully be able to check on Instagram between freelance clients and whatnot. So that is it for this lesson. If anything is unclear, you can rewatch the lesson or look at the PDF for some additional tips. Thank you for taking the course, and I will see you in the next lesson. Happy drawing.